You know, life has a way of placing us in moments that test not just our patience, but our identity, our values, and our capacity to stand in truth. And when you're dealing with someone who pulls away, someone who retreats into silence, someone who builds emotional walls, they expect you to be the one who breaks first. They expect you to chase, to fill the gap, to collapse your boundaries just to restore their comfort. But something powerful happens when you refuse to break the silence. In that stillness, you communicate a truth stronger than words. I honor myself. I honor my heart. I honor what I deserve. And suddenly, the person who's used to withdrawing has to sit inside a space they did not prepare for. Your strength. Avoidants don't just feel distance in that silence. They feel a mirror that reflects everything they've been outrunning. The fear of intimacy, the fear of losing control, the fear of being seen, and yes, the fear of losing someone who finally showed up in truth. When you stand firm, you awaken something in them. It's uncomfortable, it's confronting, it's disorienting, because for the first time they can't use escape as the answer. Your silence, rooted in self-worth, interrupts their entire pattern. And here's the divine beauty in that. Your power doesn't come from punishing them. Your power comes from honoring the sacredness of your own soul. You teach without lecturing. That connection cannot thrive on one-sided effort. That love requires presence. That respect requires reciprocity. And that you will no longer sacrifice your emotional safety for temporary moments of closeness. Let me tell you something. When you refuse to break the silence, you aren't rejecting anyone. You are rejecting the old version of you, the one who tolerated inconsistency, the one who accepted crumbs, the one who abandoned themselves to prevent being abandoned. You are stepping into alignment, into truth, into divine strength. And whether that avoidant person leans in or walks away, you win, because you didn't betray yourself, you didn't collapse your dignity, you didn't shrink to fit their fear, you rose. And in that rising, you send a message into the world, into the universe, into your own spirit. I am worthy of a love that shows up. I am worthy of a connection that chooses me. I am worthy of peace. I am worthy, period. So hold that silence if it comes, not as a weapon, but as a testament to the new standard you've set for your life. Because your presence, your energy, your heart, they are gifts. And anyone who wants access to that must rise to meet you there. Stand firm. Stand whole. Stand rooted in truth. And let the silence speak for you. When an avoidant person withdraws and you choose not to chase, not to rush in to fix the discomfort, something profound happens inside them, something they rarely show and often don't fully understand themselves. Silence becomes more than the absence of communication. It becomes an interruption of the emotional system they rely on to feel safe and in control. Avoidants are wired to manage connection by controlling its intensity. They pull back when intimacy feels too close, too unpredictable, or too emotionally charged. Distance is their safe zone, space is their oxygen, and silence is their shield. But when you don't break the silence, when you don't bridge the gap for them, their entire emotional strategy starts to unravel. They're used to you stepping in. They're used to you soothing the tension. They're used to you restoring equilibrium so they can maintain emotional distance without losing the relationship altogether. When you stop doing that, when you hold your line with grounded stillness, you remove the safety net they've depended on. Suddenly, they're not regulating the relationship on their terms anymore. They're not dictating the pace of closeness or the rhythm of communication. Your silence disrupts the pattern, and that disruption creates internal conflict, one they can't regulate by simply pulling further away. Inside, they often feel a strange mix of discomfort and curiosity. There's a tightening in their chest, a sense of losing grip on something they didn't think they needed to hold in the first place. Avoidants rarely acknowledge their emotional dependency, but it's there, buried under layers of self-protection. They want closeness, but they fear it. They crave connection, but they don't trust it. And silence creates a tension between those two opposing forces. When you refuse to break the silence, you take away their usual escape route. The distance they created doesn't feel like relief anymore. It feels like uncertainty. Instead of regaining control, they feel unsettled because for once, they don't know what you're feeling, what you're thinking, or whether you're still emotionally available. Avoidants often rely on the assumption that connection is guaranteed because you've always been the one to repair it. When you interrupt that cycle, they experience something unfamiliar, the possibility of losing you. It might not show on their face. It might not emerge in their actions immediately. But inside, silence triggers a quiet storm. They begin to wonder if they miscalculated how far they could distance themselves. They start questioning whether their withdrawal pushed too hard or whether their usual coping mechanism created a consequence they didn't expect. Silence magnifies every doubt they've tucked away, every insecurity they never expressed. There's also a deeper emotional layer, a confrontation with feelings they've suppressed for years. Avoidants manage emotional intensity by avoiding it. But silence is not neutral to them. It's a mirror. It reflects their own fears back at them. Fear of abandonment, fear of inadequacy, fear of intimacy, and fear of losing control. When you don't break the silence, they are forced to face emotions they typically outrun. They experience a pressure they can't diffuse through distance because distance is the very thing that created it. In that space, they may feel exposed, not because you're attacking them, but because the silence strips away the distraction of interaction. With nothing to escape into, their mind becomes louder. They start noticing the impact of their actions. They begin to feel the weight of their own patterns, and even if they don't express it, even if they seem calm on the outside, your silence creates an internal shift. This is the moment many avoidants begin to recognize that emotional control doesn't equal emotional safety. That withdrawing may protect them from vulnerability, but it also pushes away the very connection they secretly long for. And that awareness, silent, subtle, and unspoken, is where transformation begins. When you set a firm boundary and refuse to break the silence, you are doing more than protecting your own emotional well-being. You are creating a mirror for the avoidant to see themselves. Avoidants have spent their lives running from discomfort, managing intimacy with carefully calibrated distance, and controlling interactions so that vulnerability never fully lands on their doorstep. They rely on others to bridge gaps, to chase, to reassure, to tolerate inconsistency without consequence. When you step into self-respect and refuse to follow that predictable script, you disrupt not just their behavior but the internal narrative they have been relying on for years. This disruption forces them into self-reflection, whether they are ready for it or not. Self-reflection is uncomfortable for someone with avoidant tendencies because it demands honesty. Honesty they often avoid by retreating. Their usual defense mechanism is to distract themselves with control, distance, or even rationalization. They tell themselves that withdrawing is logical, that detachment is safe, that emotions are too risky, but your refusal to break the silence removes those distractions. There is no chase to soothe them, no reaction to manage, no external control to lean on. Suddenly the responsibility for understanding the relational tension shifts back to them. They are left alone with their thoughts, their behaviors, and their feelings, without the safety net of your compliance. This forced introspection can be jarring. Many avoidants have spent decades perfecting the art of emotional evasion. They avoid pain, they avoid conflict, and they avoid deep self-awareness, because all of these require vulnerability. But when your silence becomes unyielding, they are confronted with questions they rarely ask themselves. Why do I keep pulling away? What am I afraid of feeling? How much am I risking losing someone who refuses to tolerate my patterns? The silence doesn't yell at them. It doesn't accuse. But it quietly demands that they notice what they have been avoiding. In that quiet, avoidants may begin to feel a sense of instability. They are confronted with the consequences of their avoidance, and that realization is uncomfortable because it has been long avoided. It shakes the foundation of their emotional habits. They start seeing how their need for distance affects not only themselves but the people they care about. Your boundary, in essence, becomes a reflective surface for their own behaviors and choices. They might resist the reflection at first. They might rationalize it, blame it, or minimize it, but the seed awareness has been planted, and awareness is the first step toward meaningful change. There is also a hidden opportunity in this forced self-reflection, the chance for growth. Avoidants rarely experience moments where they cannot rely on others to maintain emotional equilibrium. When you refuse to break the silence, you interrupt the cycle of dependence they have established with others. They must confront not only their fear of intimacy, but also their fear of losing control. It is a moment where they have no option but to reckon with the reality that relationships require accountability, consistency, and effort from both sides. Even though the process is uncomfortable, it can ultimately lead to a shift in perspective. When the avoidant begins to see the impact of their withdrawal, when they recognize the tension and uncertainty that arises from their behavior, they are given the opportunity to recalibrate. They can start asking themselves questions that matter. How do I contribute to this dynamic? How do my choices affect the people I care about? How can I show up more fully without feeling overwhelmed or unsafe? Your refusal to break the silence doesn't force them to change overnight. It doesn't create instant insight or transformation. What it does is create the conditions for reflection, for self-awareness, and for accountability. It holds up a mirror that shows them what avoidance really costs, not just in the relationship, but in their own emotional growth. And even if they initially resist or react defensively, the presence of your boundary plants the seeds of recognition that could eventually guide them toward healthier ways of relating, toward courage to face their own patterns, and toward the understanding that real connection requires honesty, vulnerability, and mutual effort. When you hold your ground and refuse to break the silence, avoidants often experience a profound sense of exposure, even though they rarely admit it or show it outwardly. Avoidants are masters at creating distance, crafting walls, and shielding themselves from emotional vulnerability. Their entire relational strategy depends on controlling how much of themselves they reveal and how much they allow others to see. They cultivate a sense of safety through detachment, believing that by retreating they protect themselves from potential hurt. But your refusal to chase, to appease, or to fill the void dismantles that carefully constructed safety net. Suddenly, they are confronted with a reality they cannot control, and that confrontation can feel like being stripped bare. The sensation of exposure arises because silence removes their ability to manage the emotional exchange. Normally, avoidants operate with subtle strategies. They withdraw, they deflect, they control the pace, and they rely on the other person to restore equilibrium. Their withdrawal is predictable, and their environment conforms to their patterns. But when you refuse to respond, when you maintain your boundaries with unwavering calm, the avoidant loses that control. The very tools they have relied on to regulate emotional distance no longer work, and the structure of their relational comfort begins to crumble. This lack of control triggers a heightened sense of vulnerability, something they spend a lifetime avoiding. Inside, they may feel raw, unsettled, and even panicked. They are forced to sit with emotions they have long suppressed: uncertainty, doubt, longing, fear of loss. Silence functions as a mirror, reflecting back the parts of themselves they often hide from others, and even from their own consciousness. These feelings are disorienting because they break the narrative avoidants tell themselves about independence and self-sufficiency. Suddenly, they can no longer rely on distance alone to maintain safety. Their emotional armor is challenged, and the space you create forces them to acknowledge feelings they have carefully avoided for years. This sense of exposure is amplified by the unpredictability of your behavior. Avoidants thrive on control, on knowing how a situation will unfold, and on being able to manage relational dynamics to their advantage. When you refuse to break the silence, you disrupt that predictability. They can no longer anticipate your responses, manipulate the pace, or hide behind their detachment. They are confronted with the stark reality that the other person has their own emotional agency and will not be swayed by avoidance. This unpredictability forces them to face the emotional consequences of their actions, something they rarely encounter. Even if the avoidant responds with indifference or irritability outwardly, internally they are navigating a storm of discomfort. The silence exposes the gap between their desires and their behavior. They may long for connection but fear it simultaneously. They may crave reassurance but struggle to ask for it. In refusing to break the silence, you highlight the disparity between their need for closeness and their habitual retreat, shining a light on the tension they usually mask. This exposure is not punitive, it is revealing. It creates a rare opportunity for self-awareness. Avoidants are typically so focused on controlling external circumstances that they rarely pause to explore their own emotional landscape. Your silence, steady and uncompromising, forces them into a space where avoidance no longer serves them. They begin to confront questions they have long evaded. How much do I push others away? What am I protecting myself from? And at what cost? How does my fear of vulnerability affect the people I care about? Over time, this forced exposure can lead to an awakening. It can spark insight into patterns of avoidance, revealing the emotional truths they have hidden even from themselves. Even if they resist at first, even if defensiveness or discomfort dominates their outward behavior, the experience leaves an imprint. Silence, when rooted in self-respect and inner strength, becomes more than the absence of communication. It becomes a teacher. It exposes avoidance to their own reality, encouraging reflection, accountability, and the possibility of growth in ways that constant engagement and compromise never could. When you refuse to break the silence with someone who has avoidant tendencies, a hidden but profound emotional reaction often arises within them, a fear of abandonment. Avoidants pride themselves on self-sufficiency, on their ability to manage emotional intensity by retreating, and on their skill at keeping relationships at a comfortable distance. But underneath this carefully maintained exterior lies a deep, often unacknowledged fear. The fear that if they push too far, withdraw too much, or hold back too long, they might actually lose the people they care about. When you refuse to chase, refuse to fill the gaps, and refuse to bridge the silence, this fear is suddenly brought into sharp relief. Avoidants are accustomed to a dynamic where their withdrawal is temporary and ultimately safe. They expect the other person to step in, to restore connection, to smooth over tension, and to maintain the relationship's continuity. When you step away from that expected pattern, when you do not break the silence, they face the frightening possibility that this time their usual strategy might fail. Your steady, unwavering presence, in its very absence of chasing, challenges the illusion of control they have built. It forces them to consider, what if I have gone too far this time? What if they don't come back? This fear of abandonment is often silent, simmering beneath a calm or detached exterior. Avoidants are skilled at masking vulnerability. They rarely allow their internal anxieties to surface in obvious ways. But internally, your refusal to intervene activates a tension they cannot easily resolve. They begin to feel the weight of their own choices, the consequences of their emotional distance, and the precariousness of the connection they have taken for granted. For someone who has spent so long protecting themselves from vulnerability, the realization that they might actually lose someone they value is deeply destabilizing. At the same time, this fear is complicated by their simultaneous desire for independence. Avoidants live in a constant tension between craving connection and fearing it. They want closeness, but are terrified of being overwhelmed. They fear being emotionally dependent, while also fearing abandonment. When you refuse to break the silence, this tension intensifies. Your silence does not merely test their patience. It exposes the duality of their emotional world. They begin to recognize that their avoidance, which has served as a protective mechanism, also risks leaving them isolated from the very people they care about. This internal fear can manifest in various subtle ways. They might feel restlessness, heightened anxiety, or a creeping sense of uncertainty. They may ruminate on past interactions, replay conversations, and question whether their usual withdrawal strategies have jeopardized the relationship. These thoughts are often invisible to the outside world because avoidants rarely express vulnerability directly. Yet beneath the surface, the fear of abandonment is active, persistent, and demanding attention. The fear of abandonment also triggers a deep form of introspection. Avoidants are forced to confront the reality that relationships are reciprocal, that emotional patterns have consequences, and that they cannot rely solely on detachment to navigate intimacy. When your silence refuses to accommodate their usual coping mechanisms, they are pushed into self-reflection. They begin to recognize that their fear of closeness, while protective in some ways, also risks alienating the people they genuinely care about. This awareness, though uncomfortable, is a crucial step toward growth and transformation. Even if the avoidant does not immediately change their behavior or openly express their feelings, the internal process has begun. The fear of abandonment, once triggered, plants the seeds for awareness of their relational patterns. They may start to evaluate how their withdrawal affects the people around them and how their attempts to maintain control might paradoxically push others away. Your refusal to break the silence functions as both a mirror and a catalyst, revealing the tension between their fear of intimacy and their fear of losing connection. Ultimately, this fear is not about punishment. It is about awakening. It illuminates the emotional costs of avoidance and highlights the value of connection they have been trying to distance themselves from. By holding your ground, by refusing to collapse into the cycle of pursuit and withdrawal, you give them the opportunity to face their fears honestly, to examine the consequences of their avoidance, and to consider the possibility of choosing connection over control. It is in this tension between fear and desire, exposure and withdrawal, that transformation quietly begins to take root. When you refuse to break the silence with someone who has avoidant tendencies, your steadfastness does more than preserve your own emotional boundaries. It challenges the very patterns that have allowed them to operate safely in withdrawal for years. Avoidants rely on distance as a protective mechanism. They pull back when closeness feels threatening, when emotions feel too intense, or when vulnerability seems risky. This retreat has become a habitual rhythm, a predictable pattern they can rely on to navigate relationships without being overwhelmed. When you stand firm in your silence, refusing to chase or soothe, you disrupt that rhythm. You introduce an element they cannot control, a force that operates outside the familiar script of avoidance, and in doing so, you challenge their patterns at the core. The stability and groundedness of your presence, or even the quiet strength of your absence, creates a mirror for them. Avoidants are not accustomed to encountering someone who does not bend to their emotional distance or their avoidance strategies. They are used to the world accommodating their fears and retreating to meet them on their terms. But when you refuse to break the silence, you show them that your emotional energy is not theirs to manipulate or manage. Your strength is autonomous. Your presence is measured. Your boundaries are unshakable. This creates a subtle but powerful internal tension for them. Suddenly, the familiar strategies of avoidance lose their effectiveness. This challenge is unsettling because avoidants are deeply invested in maintaining control. They have learned to navigate relationships by predicting reactions, managing interactions, and pulling away at just the right moment to avoid vulnerability. When you hold your ground and refuse to fill the gaps, they cannot predict or control the outcome. The emotional patterns that once provided them comfort and safety are disrupted, forcing them to face the reality that relationships require more than retreat. They require engagement, accountability, and mutual effort. The challenge you present is not confrontational. It is a quiet, steady disruption of their avoidance pattern, and it compels them to reassess their habitual responses. Your silence and unwavering boundaries communicate a profound truth. Connection cannot thrive on avoidance alone. Avoidance may have spent years believing that distance guarantees safety, that withdrawal protects them from hurt, and that others will always adjust to their patterns. When you refuse to chase, when you do not compromise your emotional integrity, you reveal the limitations of this belief. You show them that emotional safety is not achieved through withdrawal, but through mutual respect, responsibility, and presence. This revelation can be uncomfortable, even disorienting, because it challenges the assumptions that have governed their relational behavior for years. The challenge you present also carries the potential for awakening. When avoidants encounter someone who models steadiness and self-respect, they are given an opportunity to see a different way of relating. They witness firsthand that it is possible to maintain boundaries, communicate with integrity, and preserve emotional strength without retreating into fear or distance. This can plant seeds of curiosity and self-reflection. They may begin to wonder if their avoidance is limiting their ability to experience genuine connection, intimacy, and trust. The disruption of their pattern encourages them to confront the very fears they have long evaded, even if that confrontation is subtle and slow to surface. Importantly, this challenge is not about control or manipulation on your part. It is about embodying your own truth. Avoidance may initially respond with discomfort, irritation, or increased withdrawal, but the deeper effect occurs internally. They begin to recognize the gap between the relational patterns that have served them and the type of connection they truly desire. The quiet power of your presence, or the deliberate strength of your silence, forces them to reckon with their habitual avoidance. Over time, this can shift their perception, motivating them to reconsider how they approach intimacy, trust, and vulnerability. By holding firm, you reveal a principle that cannot be argued with. Connection requires effort, boundaries, and integrity from both sides. Your refusal to break the silence demonstrates that avoidance cannot dictate the terms of the relationship indefinitely. It challenges them to see the limits of their patterns and encourages growth, even if subtly. In essence, your strength disrupts avoidance not through confrontation, but through the quiet demonstration of consistency, self-respect, and unshakable presence. It is in this space, between your steadfastness and their habitual retreat, that true awareness and potential transformation begin to emerge. When you refuse to break the silence with someone who is avoidant, you are doing more than maintaining your boundaries. You are creating a space for transformation that is subtle, powerful, and deeply instructive. Avoidants have spent years cultivating strategies to avoid discomfort, regulate their emotions through distance, and maintain a sense of control over their connections. Their coping mechanisms revolve around creating separation at key moments, retreating when intimacy feels too intense, and relying on others to smooth over relational turbulence. But when you hold your ground in silence, you interrupt the familiar cycle, and in doing so, you create an unexpected opportunity for growth, reflection, and eventual transformation. Avoidants often live in a delicate balance between fear and desire. They fear vulnerability and closeness, yet they also crave connection, even if they don't fully admit it to themselves. This internal tension is usually managed through withdrawal, detachment, and the subtle manipulation of relational patterns. When you refuse to break the silence, you remove the usual outlet that allows them to maintain this balance on their terms. They cannot rely on your reassurance, your emotional labor, or your attempts to restore the connection for them. This disruption creates a tension that is uncomfortable but necessary. It is the very tension that holds the potential for transformation. In this silence, they are forced to confront the reality of their avoidance. Avoidants are rarely encouraged to sit with their own feelings, to examine the patterns that guide their relational behavior, or to experience the consequences of withdrawal without immediate rescue. Your refusal to step in serves as a mirror, reflecting back the ways they have avoided intimacy, suppressed vulnerability, and relied on others to accommodate their emotional distance. For the first time, or perhaps the first time in a long while, they are faced with the full weight of their relational choices. The transformative potential of this moment lies in its subtlety. Change does not occur through pressure, confrontation, or coercion. Instead, it arises from awareness, the quiet realization that their habitual strategies no longer yield the security they once provided. They may begin to feel the consequences of their avoidance, the strain on relationships, the distance they have created between themselves and others, and the subtle erosion of trust and closeness. Even if they do not express it outwardly, this awareness begins to shift their internal landscape. They are confronted with the gap between the life they have been living, driven by fear and withdrawal, and the deeper connection they may secretly long for. Silence also invites self-reflection, one of the most potent catalysts for transformation. Avoidants are often so accustomed to running from discomfort that they rarely pause to examine the impact of their actions. In the quiet, without the usual external interventions to rescue or reassure them, they are left with their thoughts and feelings. Questions arise: how does my avoidance affect the people I care about? How much of my fear of vulnerability is limiting my ability to form meaningful relationships? What would it look like to approach connection with honesty rather than retreat? These questions are difficult and uncomfortable, but they open the door to insight, accountability, and personal growth. Another crucial aspect of this transformative process is the way it fosters emotional resilience. By standing firm in silence, you model a type of relational integrity that avoids manipulation and fear-driven behavior. Avoidants witness that connection does not have to be a battleground of control and retreat. It can exist with boundaries, consistency, and mutual respect. This modeling over time encourages them to reconsider their own approach to relationships and to explore healthier, more balanced ways of engaging. Ultimately, your refusal to break the silence creates a sacred space for transformation. Avoidants are confronted with their avoidance patterns, their unacknowledged fears, and the consequences of their habitual withdrawals. In this space, they are invited to grow, to reflect, and to cultivate the courage to face vulnerability rather than evade it. The silence is not empty. It is alive with the potential for awareness, insight, and lasting change. It is in this quiet, steady presence, free from manipulation or compromise, that real transformation begins to take root, quietly reshaping the way they perceive themselves, their relationships, and the possibility of genuine connection. As we draw this journey to a close, remember that refusing to break the silence is not an act of punishment, but a profound declaration of self-respect, integrity, and the courage to hold space for transformation for both yourself and those who struggle with avoidance. By standing firm, you illuminate patterns, invite self-reflection, and create the possibility for authentic connection, showing that true growth emerges not from chasing or yielding, but from clarity, boundaries, and unwavering presence. Embrace the power within you to inspire change through your strength and carry this wisdom into every relationship, every challenge, and every moment of choice. Thank you for opening your mind and heart to this message, for embracing the lessons of courage and transformation, and for stepping boldly into the space where change becomes possible. May you move forward with clarity, confidence, and compassion. Goodbye, and may your journey be one of profound insight and unwavering strength.